I stood beneath a decorative arch draped in fake hydrangeas, scanning the driveway for what felt like the 100th time. My husband Graham balanced 2 paper cups of lukewarm punch, whispering a hushed argument with our youngest about whether shoes were optional, while my son leaned against a folding chair with that preteen slouch that declared he was too cool to be seen with us. But my attention wasn't on them. It was on my phone, on the empty notification screen, on the absence of my daughter Evelyn. She was supposed to be here already. 3 weeks ago, Evelyn had picked out her dress with the excitement of someone finally being included, finally recognized. She even had it dry cleaned, a rare extravagance for a college student who spent more money on textbooks than clothes. She had made a gift herself, a photo frame etched with care tucked carefully into her carry-on so it wouldn't break. She had flown 5 hours just to be here for my parents' vow renewal. It was supposed to be a celebration, a big day, and she had promised me I'll be their mom. I wouldn't miss it. By now, sweat prickled at the back of my dress as I checked my phone again. No calls, no texts. I found my mother near the back patio, fussing with candles like she was directing a stage play. My father hovered nearby with his ever-present clipboard, as if someone might steal the vows. I forced a smile and asked if we could wait a few more minutes, explaining that Evelyn's flight had only just landed. My mother glanced at me with perfect composure, brushing away invisible lint from the tablecloth. "Oh, she was already here," she said casually. I blinked, confused. My father added that Evelyn had arrived early around noon. For a moment, I couldn't process the words. If she had arrived, then where was she? My mother's answer was delivered as if she were reciting a grocery list. They told her it wasn't the right day for her to be there, that she wasn't really part of the family. My father folded his arms, confirming it with a nod. Evelyn hadn't argued, they insisted. She had been very respectful. The ground shifted under me. My daughter had flown across the country, spent her own money, carried her hopes in a small bag, and they had turned her away at the door. My mother smoothed the tablecloth again, as though neat fabric could justify what she had done. She called it keeping things simple, intimate. I glanced at the RSVP list in her hand, 87 names printed neatly, and nearly laughed at the absurdity. Intimate. I wanted to scream, but my voice came out thin, shaking. Evelyn had always been careful, always too respectful, too willing to fold herself small, so no one else felt uncomfortable. Of course she didn't argue. Of course she walked away quietly. My chest ached with the knowledge of it. I bent down to my children and told them to grab their things. Graham caught on immediately, tossing the punch and collecting bags. My mother's eyes widened. "Don't be dramatic," she said. I didn't respond. We walked out, silent heads held high. The air outside was hot and sticky, pressing down like punishment. I tried calling Evelyn, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I texted nothing. Graham buckled the kids in, then stood beside me as I gripped my phone, desperate for some sign. Minutes later, a message came. "Are you free now?" I called her back immediately. Her voice was small, trembling. She told me she was fine, but the truth lived between her words. She was sitting in a cafe down the road, unsure where else to go. And then she repeated the line my parents had given her, the line that echoed from my own childhood. They decided I'm not part of the family anymore. The silence between us was heavy, alive with pain. I told her it wasn't her fault. She hadn't ruined anything. They had. I told her we were coming. Graham was already pulling out of the driveway. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. But something inside me snapped clean, like the thinnest wire finally breaking. I opened a folder on my phone, scrolled through the contacts, and placed a call. 30 minutes later, while we sat with Evelyn in that cafe, my parents were shouting in panic, their voices rising through the phone lines. I used to believe they were merely flawed and perfect like all parents. Maybe a bit old-fashioned, sometimes blunt, occasionally unkind, but not cruel. not deliberately. But when my daughter repeated those words, when I heard my past spoken back to me through her, I knew better. This wasn't a new wound. It was a pattern, a rerun. And this time, I wasn't going to apologize for existing. We found Evelyn sitting by the window of a small cafe, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. She looked up when we walked in, blinking as if she wasn't sure we were real. Her eyes were red but dry, her shoulders squared as though she was bracing for another blow. I hugged her before I could stop myself, crushing her into my arms. She didn't resist. She had always been so careful not to take up space, but in that moment, she let me hold her, like she was a little girl again. We ordered fries and drinks that no one touched. The kids sat quietly, unsure what to do, while Graham tried to keep the air steady with his calm presence. I kept replaying the moment my parents had turned her away, their smooth explanations, their smug certainty that Evelyn would accept their decision without protest. And she had. Respectful, they had said. What they meant was silent. My phone buzzed on the table. My brother Colin. I sighed, knowing exactly what was coming, and answered. His voice exploded through the line, incredulous, demanding to know if I had truly walked out of our parents' vow renewal. He called Evelyn dramatic, suggested she had misunderstood. He insisted I was blowing up decades of family tradition over nothing. I told him she had flown 5 hours, paid for her own ticket, skipped her plans, and been told she wasn't family. He scoffed loud enough that I had to pull the phone away from my ear. He ranted about what I had done to our parents, how they were devastated, how they had been in tears. Good, I said quietly. For once, the silence on his end was louder than his shouting. Then he snapped, told me I had lost my mind, accused me of trying to ruin the family. I cut him off. If one person could ruin a big day, I told him, then it was never about love. It was a performance. And I hung up mid-sentence, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. Evelyn reached over, touching my hand gently, not speaking, but grounding me. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mother. Graham tried to stop me, but I answered. Her voice hissed with fury, dripping with shame, cloaked as disappointment. She accused me of humiliating them, of making a scene. I reminded her of what she had done, that she had slammed the door in her granddaughter's face. She denied it, insisted she hadn't been cruel, claimed we were misinterpreting. Then came the guilt trip. She begged me to come back to stop embarrassing them, to think of appearances. I told her no. Minutes later, a text came from my sister Ruth. We're leaving too. Relief flooded me. For once, I wasn't alone. Ruth arrived at the cafe soon after, her husband and kids trailing behind. Their faces were stunned, tired, and slightly disbelieving, as if they too were waking from a dream. We pushed tables together. For a while, no one spoke. Then Ruth quietly admitted she had seen the pattern for years, how our parents always leaned on me, always dismissed me, how we all pretended it was normal. She apologized in a way that mattered, not with words alone, but by choosing to stand beside me in public. Messages trickled in from cousins still at the event. The slideshow had frozen. Guests were leaving. My mother had grabbed the microphone and declared it was all a misunderstanding, her voice brittle and sharp. The updates would have once filled me with guilt, but now they felt distant, like a storm breaking somewhere else. That night, sitting with Evelyn curled against me on the couch, I realized what had shifted. We had broken the cycle. We hadn't swallowed the insult or smoothed over the cruelty. We had walked out together in front of everyone and let the silence speak for us. It was terrifying and freeing all at once. In the days that followed, the fallout came swiftly. My parents called, sent messages, knocked on my door with their rehearsed sweetness, claiming misunderstandings, offering excuses. They wanted to talk to Evelyn alone to smooth it over. She stood before them with calm composure, arms crossed, and reminded them of exactly what they had said. "You told me I wasn't family anymore." My mother gasped, my father backpedaled, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She told them she wasn't angry, she was just done. And then she walked away, leaving them standing on the porch with their empty folders and their empty words. I felt pride swell inside me. Pride that my daughter had found the strength I had taken decades to discover. By the third day, the silence had turned heavy. Not the peaceful kind, but the loaded silence of unanswered calls, of voicemails left in anger, of stories already being rewritten behind closed doors. My aunt called Ruth, claiming my mother said it was all a misunderstanding. My uncle sent me a half-hearted text, checking in without actually saying anything. And Colin? He stormed around telling anyone who would listen that he had been left to foot the entire bill for the vow renewal because his sisters had lost their minds. Then came the message from Ruth. They changed the will. Colin's the sole heir now. I stared at the screen, almost laughing at the predictability of it. I replied with 2 words, "Let him." And I meant it. I was done buying my way into a family that had never wanted me in the first place. Let him inherit their debts along with their approval. I wasn't chasing scraps anymore. But Colin wasn't finished. At 7:42 the next morning, a voicemail came through, his voice tight with fury. "Moira, what the hell is this? You think you can just skip out on the bill? We made a family agreement. You don't get to throw a tantrum at Mom and Dad's big day and then stick me with the invoices. Grow up." I played it twice, then set the phone down and flipped a pancake for Evelyn, who was still staying with us. She wanted pancakes before her flight back to school, so that's what she got. Family, I realized, wasn't about agreements scribbled on paper or expectations shouted down the line. Family was this cooking breakfast, listening, showing up without conditions. By afternoon, the panic arrived in person. My parents knocked on the door, dressed for dignity, my father in his blazer, my mother clutching a folder as though it might contain forgiveness. They wore the polite smiles they saved for neighbors and church acquaintances, the ones meant to smooth over any unpleasantness. Graham offered to answer, but I shook my head. This was mine. They opened with sweetness, saying they wanted to clear the air that there had been a misunderstanding. They asked to speak to Evelyn alone. She came downstairs, calm, collected, her arms crossed in quiet strength. My parents began their performance. How much they loved her, how they never meant to hurt her, how chaotic the day had been. They insisted they only meant close family. Evelyn didn't falter. "I flew 5 hours," she said evenly. "I bought a dress. I brought a gift. And you wouldn't even let me in the building." My mother tried again, her voice trembling with false innocence. "Sweetheart, that's not fair." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply said, "Neither is what you did. I'm not mad. I'm just done." Then she walked out of the room, leaving them staring at the space she had vacated. I don't think I had ever felt prouder in my life. They left a few minutes later, their folder unopened. Their smiles cracked. That night, Evelyn sat next to me on the couch, her head resting against my shoulder. "I don't want to keep trying for people who don't try." "Back," she said softly. I didn't answer right away, struck by how much stronger she was at her age than I had ever been. "I used to fall for it too," I finally admitted. She shook her head gently. "You didn't. You just needed time." By the end of the week, the smear campaign was in full swing. Extended relatives whispered about my dramatic exit. My parents told anyone who would listen that I had ruined their anniversary, that Evelyn had misunderstood. Colin raged about being saddled with invoices. But Ruth stood firm, her text steady, her voice unwavering whenever we spoke. For the first time, I wasn't fighting alone. One night, after the calls had stopped and the house was finally quiet, I sat with Graham in the kitchen. He poured us each a glass of water and said simply, You did the right thing. I looked at him, waiting for doubt, for a caveat, for the familiar suggestion that maybe I had gone too far. But his eyes held nothing but calm certainty. You chose Evelyn. That's the only choice that mattered. And in that moment, I believed him. The call I made from the parking lot did not come from fury so much as clarity. I had signed the event liability policy as a favor weeks earlier because my parents' coverage had lapsed and the venue required proof on file the morning of the celebration. I had also placed my card on the bar's hold because the champagne wall and roaming violinist had been added late and the planner needed a guarantor. In the cafe with Evelyn breathing steadily beside me and Ruth on her way, I phoned the planner and informed her calmly, professionally, that I was revoking authorization for any charges tied to my name and withdrawing my certificate from the file effective immediately. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was the simple refusal to underwrite the story they were performing at our expense. Within 30 minutes, the venue manager needed a new card, the caterer asked for updated proof of insurance, and the bar closed until someone provided both. That was when the shouting started, a chorus of confusion and fear bouncing between phones and the courtyard, while we sat quietly under the cafe's industrial lights eating fries we didn't taste. I didn't owe them my signature anymore, and I would not rent my silence to cover the cost of their cruelty. Word of our exit traveled faster than any apology. Cousins texted from the patio as the slideshow stalled, and the microphone squealed as my mother announced into the speakers that misunderstandings had occurred and everything was fine now, as chairs scraped and guests drifted toward the valet in small, embarrassed clusters. I would once have felt the pull to fix it, to grab a laptop and rerun the slideshow, to refill glasses and smooth the tablecloths my mother loved to smooth. Instead, I watched Evelyn point out constellations of grease on the cafe tabletop and make her little cousin laugh by folding a napkin into a clumsy swan. It was ordinary and perfect, a slender strip of peace laid across a day that had tried to devour it. The next morning, the invoices began to fly, digital envelopes landing with thuds in our inboxes. The planner's balance, the florist's final bill, the bar's restocking fee now that the hold had evaporated. Colin called before I had coffee, leaving a message pulsing with outrage about agreements and adulthood and the price of disloyalty. I listened once and then set the phone face down while pancakes browned in the pan and Evelyn stirred syrup into the shape of a heart she pretended not to notice. Family, I decided, wasn't a ledger. It was breakfast. It was the quiet decision to show up for the person who had been sent away. By afternoon, my parents appeared at our door with their best imitation of humility. My father wore his reasonable blazer. My mother clutched a folder I suspected held an apology she had no intention of reading. They asked to speak to Evelyn alone. She agreed, not because she owed them anything, but because she understood that closure sometimes needed a witness. I stood in the kitchen within earshot, not eavesdropping, only standing guard, while they tried to recast the day as chaos, as misinterpretation, as the regrettable product of stress. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not itemize her injuries. She said only that she had flown 5 hours, bought a dress, brought a gift, and been told she was not family, that she was not angry, that she was done. Their folder remained unopened. They left with their smiles cracked like porcelain after a fall, the kind you glue and pretend is whole. The smear campaign arrived on schedule. Aunts called Ruth to murmur about misunderstandings. An uncle sent me a text that meant nothing and everything. "You okay?" Colin raged publicly about invoices and privately about betrayal, rehearsing into any phone that would hold him how we had humiliated our parents. Ruth, meanwhile, chose her side with the steady dignity of someone who had finally stepped out of the fog. She and I spoke in short calls that were mostly silence, the kind of silence that says I am here without demanding you perform your pain for proof. When she texted to say the will had been updated and Colin would inherit everything I wrote, that he could have it. She sent a single checkmark back, the punctuation of a promise that we were finished paying for entry into rooms built to exclude us. In the weeks that followed, the world shrank into a healthier shape. I blocked numbers I didn't need. I stopped correcting rumors I had not sown. I let the invoices circle back to the people who ordered the champagne and the violin. Graham held the door open for this new life as calmly as he had for the old one. In the evenings, Evelyn sat on the couch with a blanket she stole from my closet and filled out internship applications. Sometimes she looked tired, in that way you get when you finally stopped smiling for other people. But there was a steadiness in her I recognized as the future. When she said she didn't want to keep trying for people who didn't try back, I chose to believe her instead of teaching her to endure. On the third weekend after the vow renewal, I drove past the venue alone and saw a wedding spilling joy onto the lawn. Real joy, the kind that doesn't need managing. For a moment, I imagined the alternate version of our day, where we had been kinder to ourselves, where my mother had extended a hand instead of building a gate, where my father had put down the clipboard and picked up his granddaughter's gift. I let the picture go as the light changed. Fantasy cannot hold a life together. Boundaries can. Inside our house, the air felt different, lighter, like something had been removed that we had mistaken for furniture, but had been a weight. I opened my calendar and deleted recurring reminders tied to obligations that had never been reciprocated. Then I marked Evelyn's flight back to school, and the afternoon Graham and I would help carry her suitcase up 3 floors because the elevator was out. We would do it gladly, and we would not post about it for applause. When the doorbell rang that evening, it was only a delivery driver with a box addressed to me in my mother's hand. Inside lay a stack of printed photos from the event we had left, glossy rectangles of a performance staged after the audience walked out. I slid them back into the envelope, taped it shut, wrote, "Return to sender," and set it by the door. Not in anger, not as a message, only as an acknowledgement that I had no room left for pictures of a story that had never made space for us. The seasons turned while the silence held. At first, it felt unnatural, the absence of their demands, the missing weight of phone calls that always began with pleasantries and ended with obligations. But over time, I realized that what I mistook for quiet was really space, the kind of space you need to breathe, to build, to remember who you are, without the noise. Evelyn graduated that spring, walking across a stage in her cap and gown, her eyes bright with a freedom I hadn't known at her age. She landed a job she loved, found friends who felt like family, and moved into a studio apartment that, despite its size, radiated more warmth than the house I grew up in ever had. She never mentioned her grandparents. The silence wasn't bitterness, it was erasure, and she didn't seem to miss what had never truly been there. Months later, Colin appeared at my doorstep unannounced. Graham answered, and I stayed seated on the couch, listening to the low rumble of my brother's voice in the entryway. He looked worn down, his sharpness dulled into something closer to exhaustion. He asked whether we planned to resume helping Mom and Dad. Apparently, the travel clubs and imported furniture and endless appearances had left bills piled higher than he could manage. Our parents had promised him everything: the house, the savings, the legacy. He had covered their costs in exchange for a fantasy inheritance that turned out to be smoke. Their net worth was negative, their house mortgaged to the max. They had lied to him too, and now he wanted me to share the burden. I didn't even get up to answer. Graham told him calmly that we were done. Colin left in anger, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt less like departure and more like confirmation. He would discover what we already had: loyalty offered to people who see you only as currency is a contract that can never be fulfilled. I thought I might feel vindicated. Instead, what I felt was distance, like watching a storm rage across an ocean you once nearly drowned in. The lies, the manipulation, the endless recalculations of who counted as family, it had all come home to roost, and they were left alone in the wreckage. I could pity them without reopening the door. That, I realized, was its own kind of closure. Life now is quieter, but it's also fuller in ways that matter. Evelyn visits often, her laughter filling the rooms that once held only tension. Ruth and I speak regularly, not about the past, but about the small present moments, her kids' soccer games, the recipes she's learning, the way she has started therapy and wants to do better for her children. There is no grand reconciliation, no cinematic apology from our parents, no miracle return to the family table. There is only the truth and the choice of what to do with it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear echoes of my mother's voice, smoothing away cruelty with the word intimate. I still see my father folding his arms as if authority could make his words final. And I still remember the first time I was told I wasn't really part of the family back when I was 12, sitting with a grocery store cake that had the wrong name written on it. For years, I believed those moments defined me. Now I see them for what they were, evidence of their limitations, not of mine. The last time I sorted through old mail, I found an envelope stuffed with printed photos from that vow renewal, glossy snapshots of a night that pretended nothing had happened. I didn't even open them. I slid the envelope into the trash. It wasn't anger. It was simply making space. The family I needed was already here, in Evelyn's determination, in Graham's steady love, in Ruth's late but real solidarity, and in myself at last, unafraid to draw boundaries that held. So here is the lesson I carry, the one I hope my daughter carries too. Family is not proven by blood or by titles on invitations. It is proven by presence, by effort, by love that asks nothing in return. The moment someone tells you you are not family, believe them and choose yourself. Cutting ties is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is survival. And survival, I've learned, is its own kind of love. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below with your own experiences, because your voice matters and your story deserves to be heard.